Ready?
All right, let's get started with today. I wanted to do a little bit of review like we do in class. I would suggest pausing this video and I would work through these words. See if you can just say this stuff out loud. All right, so I would pause the video now and do that. All right, I'm going to go over it. Federalist 78. Federalist 78 is kind of like Federalist 70. You can sum it up in one or two sentences. Basically, that the federal judges should have life terms. The only way they can be removed from office is if they are impeached. They're not elected, so therefore, because of all that, they're insulated from public opinion. And we want an independent judiciary. We don't want them doing what's popular. We want them to do what is constitutional, right? We want them defending the Constitution. Article 3 creates the Supreme Court, and then it says Congress creates the lower court.
Congress makes the inferior courts, kids.
Congress creates kind of the three-tier court system we have. Article 3 creates the Supreme Court. It also talks about the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. So that's the cases that have to be heard at the Supreme Court first, which are rare. So a case that involves an ambassador and a case that involves a public minister, honestly, I can't even think of any. So they hear very few of those cases. 97%, 98, 99%, something like that of the cases they hear on appellate jurisdiction. And that is the power to hear cases that have been heard in lower courts before. Most of the court cases that we are going to get into in this class, and some of the ones we already have, started in lower courts, and then on appeals, they work their way up to the Supreme Court. All right. So original jurisdiction is just simply that court has the power to hear that case first. That case is going to start in that court first. Appellate jurisdiction means that the court can hear cases that have already been heard in lower courts. District courts do not have appellate jurisdiction, but the appeals courts, our district courts in the United States do, and our Supreme Court does as well. Don't get too hung up on that stuff. All right. I realize that's kind of some heady information there, and it's kind of confusing. Don't get too hung up on that stuff. The College Board doesn't really assess that. Never seen that show up in writing or anything like that. All right, so we have that three-level court system, right? Supreme Court's at the top, the appellate courts, and then the district courts. We have like 94 district courts in the United States. They're split up by state. That's where most federal cases are going to be heard first. Okay, well, what kind of cases would be heard in these district courts? Anything where, if you've broken a law that has to do with Article 1, Section 8, so you are counterfeiting money or something like that, you're going to land in a federal district court. And then you could appeal your case, and that could go up to the appellate court. And then if there's something really important about your case that needs some constitutional clarity, you could appeal that up to the Supreme Court if the appellate court rules against you. All right, precedent is just when the courts make a ruling, they're setting precedent. And then future courts are expected to use that precedent. Otherwise, because we want continuity in the court system. We don't want a bunch of contradictory court cases. That would create a mess. So there's this idea of stare decisis, which means let the decision stand. So judges will look at past rulings when they rule on future cases or cases they're hearing before them at that time. A strict constructionist is somebody that thinks that you should use the framers' original intent when considering court cases. We should look at the framers' original intent in the Constitution. We should look at exactly what these words mean. As they were written in the 1790s, whereas a liberal constructionist says, well, there's been societal changes, so the meaning behind these words change, right? And then I said a liberal constructionist might look at the Eighth Amendment, the idea of cruel and unusual punishment, and say, hey, in the 1790s, stealing a horse meant you were going to be hanged, but in 2020, we would consider that pretty extreme. We would consider that cruel and unusual. Therefore, we have to look at the fact that the meaning of these words have changed over time. Judicial activism is when judges actively change public policy. So judicial review in and of itself is not judicial activism, okay? Because if there's some law that is in clear contrast to the Constitution, then using that judicial review would not be activism. It's when the judges freely start to strike down a lot of cases and create public policy that they're considered being activist. All right. Now, there are those proponents of judicial activism that say the courts should correct social injustices where the other branches have failed to do so. But anytime really the judges are changing public policy, okay, you're seeing some activism there. Judicial restraint says that judges should not be striking down many laws, and that the changes in public policy should be coming from the people voting in representatives that actually make public policy. It shouldn't be coming from the courts. Okay, so how do cases reach the Supreme Court? This is a little bit complicated. You get some Latin in here as well. There's a lot of Latin phrases in the court unit. Just bear with me here. All right, so first up, let's say you are landed in a lower court. You broke some federal crime. You landed in a lower court, and let's say you lost that case. All right, you could write what's called a petition for certiorari. And it's a legal brief arguing why the lower court got your case wrong. All right. If the petition is deemed worthy, that should say worthy, not worth, it will go on the discuss list. So the Supreme Court has this discuss list. All right. And that's cases they feel like may need to be heard before the Supreme Court. So, for instance, we could take one of our cases like United States versus Lopez. Lopez at some point wrote a petition for certiorari. His attorneys wrote a petition for certiorari saying, hey, the lower court's got it wrong because, this is really federal overreach. That went on the Supreme Court's discuss list. All 9 Supreme Court justices will meet periodically to discuss the cases on the discuss list. All right. And if 4 of the 9 justices want to hear the case, it is called up from the lower court to be heard by the Supreme Court. This process of calling up the case is known as a writ of certiorari. So again, using the Lopez case, his attorneys wrote a petition for certiorari, which is just a legal brief saying, here's why the lower courts are getting this wrong. Here's why the government's wrong. That was deemed worthy, so it went on the discuss list. The Supreme Court justices discussed it as a group. 4 of the 9 agreed to hear the case. They said, hey, you know what? This is worthy of being heard before the Supreme Court. We need to provide some constitutional clarity here. And then the Supreme Court issued this writ of certiorari. All right. You do kind of need to be able to explain that. I have seen this show up in the writing in years past where they say, like, it just, explain the process of this writ of certiorari. It starts with the petition of certiorari, goes on the discuss list. The judges discuss it. 4 of the 9 agree to hear it. This is known in the rule of 4. They're going to issue that writ of certiorari. They're going to call the case up, and now it's going to be heard before the Supreme Court. Okay, so let's say the Supreme Court issues that writ of certiorari and the case gets called up, and they're going to hear the case. Both sides will issue legal briefs. So the Supreme Court is very familiar with the case. They're going to read through these legal briefs. The legal brief is just their argument on why the case should rule in their favor. It usually includes a lot of past cases, precedent, and brings the Constitution into it as well. The actual Supreme Court case is very short. It's not like one of these TV shows like Law and Order where these things can go on for weeks or whatnot. It's actually like each side gets like 1 hour to go before the 9 judges. The 9 judges ask some really hard and pointed questions. They argue their case. And then the judges go back and then they vote. If 5 justices agree one way, that's going to be the majority opinion. So at least 5 justices, the majority, are on the same opinion on a case. This becomes the majority opinion. The majority opinion becomes the law of the land. The concurring opinion, these might be justices that agree with the majority. So they're like, hey, yeah, I agree that we should rule this way, but I have some reservations about why you're ruling the way you are. I have some reservations about your reasoning. I think it's something else in the Constitution, or I think there's a different legal reasoning. The dissenting opinion, these are those justices in the minority that explain why they think the court got it wrong. So dissenting opinions may be referenced later in cases if the court might revisit the issue, but they're not legally binding on the country in any way, shape, or form. All right. The majority opinion is the law of the land. All right. So, for example, Brown versus Board of Education, that was actually a 9-0 decision. It was unanimous. So all of the justices were in the majority opinion. Okay, sometimes and usually one of them will write the majority opinion. It's not always the Chief Justice. It's one of them decides to write the majority opinion. But then you could take a case like Texas versus Johnson, which is burning the American flag in protest constitutionally protected free speech. That was a 5-4 decision. So one of them is going to write that majority opinion of those 5 that ruled in favor of Johnson in this instance, the guy that's burning the American flag. And then 4 of them might each write dissenting opinions, and usually they do. If they disagree with the court, if there's 4 of them, all 4 of them will usually write a dissenting opinion. All right. Again, those are not legally binding in any way, shape, or form, but they could be used later if the court revisits the issue. The attorney that's maybe arguing in their favor might bring up their dissenting opinions. So these are actually some excerpts from the majority opinion and dissenting opinion in Texas versus Johnson. This is not one of your required court cases. It's an interesting case, though, where an individual had burned the American flag in protest in Texas. Texas had a law that says you can't do that. They ruled in favor of Johnson and saying that, this is constitutionally protected free speech. Their majority opinion was flag burning constitutes a form of symbolic speech that is protected by the First Amendment. Freedom of speech protects actions that society may find very offensive, but society's outrage alone is not justification for suppressing free speech. Now, usually these majority opinions are very, very lengthy. This is just kind of the main idea from it. So this is not the entire majority opinion. Same goes for the dissenting opinion. They're usually very, very lengthy. This is just an excerpt from it. It's just kind of the main idea. The dissenting opinion in this instance, the flag's unique status as a symbol of national unity outweighs symbolic speech concerns, and thus the government can lawfully prohibit flag burning. However, 4 justices were in the minority there. 5 justices were in the majority on this particular issue. Therefore, that becomes law of the land, that flag burning is constitutionally protected free speech. Okay, that's it for today.
Bye, kids. Make sure to do your homework.